Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Heather Hansen, and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement at the University of Colorado Boulder's Lead School of Business. Welcome to our 9th webinar series. We have certainly faced some trying times over the past year and a half, and here at CU Boulder, we've gathered our world-renowned faculty and alumni to provide frank and timely insights to help you learn and navigate these times. Today is the third of 4 webinars in this webinar series. To view upcoming webinars, please visit colorado.edu/business/alumni, click the drop-down arrow and click Attend Online Webinars. For today's webinar, we're excited to welcome Pat Meyers, who is here presenting Colorado State response to the COVID-19 pandemic. A few housekeeping before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Pat, send a question through the Q&A interface. We monitor questions as they are submitted and will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with a survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. Patrick Meyers is a graduate of the University of Colorado at Denver and the University of California Hastings School of Law. He served in the U.S. Navy's submarine services from 1978 to 1984. After graduating from law school, Pat clerked for the Honorary Justice William Erickson of the Colorado Supreme Court, and thereafter was an attorney with Moyer Giles in Denver. In 1997, Pat served the General Counsel's office at Quiznos and subsequently became an owner of the company until June 2012. After that, Pat became a partner, managing director, and the chief legal officer for Consumer Capital Partners. Pat was an owner of CCP's newest venture, Smashburger, until the chain's sale in 2018. In December 2017, Pat was appointed the chief of staff to Colorado's governor, John Hickenlooper, and served in the role until the governor's term ended in 2019. Pat was a senior advisor to now Senator Hickenlooper and was chief operating officer of Governor Hickenlooper's U.S. presidential campaign. In March 2020, Pat was appointed the Constrained Medical Supply Team Leader for the state of Colorado's COVID Innovation Response Team, where he led the team obtaining PPE and other medical supplies for the state. In 2021, Pat was awarded the Colorado Governor's Citizenship Award for his work on the COVID response team. In March 2021, Pat was appointed by Governor Polis as the Executive Director of the Office of Economic Development and International Trade and as the Chief Economic Recovery Officer for the state of Colorado. Pat and his twin daughters are also the directors of the Meyers Family Foundation. Pat, we are thrilled to have you here. I am now going to hand over the webinar controls to you.
Thank you, Heather, and good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully my sound is working okay in this Zoom life we've all become accustomed to. So today's agenda is really a pretty high-level overview of some of the economic issues that the state faced starting in February of 2020, where we are today, and how we as a state are handling the influx of federal money through the ARPA program, the American Rescue Plan Act, which was passed in March of 2012. We're also going to look at some state stimulus dollars and our current thinking on an implementation model. I did not have much to do with vaccines or testing, so I'm not going to touch very much on that, though we will give you a little bit of numbers for where the state stands. But I'm more a lawyer than a scientist, so and economics maybe, so I'll stick with that end of things. So where are we today? And I'm going to move this up here. As far as Colorado's COVID numbers, so you can see below, and this is as of yesterday, we had just over 554,000 COVID cases, about 3.1 million tests, just over 6,900 deaths due to COVID, 6.2 million vaccines administered, and about 2.8 million fully vaccinated Coloradans, which that number is is a number that we're continuing to try and grow as we speak, actually. So as Heather noted, I was appointed to the COVID emergency response team, which was called the IRT, Innovative Response Team, in March of 2020. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide because this kind of illustrates what the state and really all of the states were going through in February and March of last year. So as COVID started to hit, there was a lot that we didn't know. I think clinicians would tell you that there was a tremendous amount about how to treat COVID, how infectious it was, how deadly it was, things that worked, things that didn't, that we didn't know. But we did know that it was potentially a very significant crisis for the state of Colorado and for the United States and for the world, for that matter. The one effect of all of this lack of knowledge going into February and March was that the supply chains became very constricted on anything that people thought they would need to combat COVID. So by that, I mean, healthcare wasn't sure exactly what things were going to look like in the next 30, 60, 90 days, but they felt fairly certain that there was going to be a shortage of PPE and medical equipment such as masks, ventilators, gowns, gloves, etc. And so began ordering in quantities. One supplier told me were 10 years worth of quantity based on historical usage, 10 years. So there were a couple of effects of that. One, there's no manufacturing capability in the world that's going to be able to supply that level of product. It just didn't exist. Two, and this also came from a different supplier, the just N95 masks, which were the NR, the kind of gold standard of masks, you've heard that term before, those flipped in 1 month from 80% industrial usage and 20% medical to 80% medical, 20% industrial. So the manufacturers and the mainline distribution network froze because it was trying to fulfill as many orders for the medical community as possible and couldn't keep up with the orders, obviously. But what that meant was other end users really did not have access to medical equipment or PPE. And this is just an example of what was going on in February and March. The market not only froze, but the gray market that stepped in was a market that was very, very, let's say, not transparent. It was a market in which there was a lot of counterfeit material. The prices were enormous. I'll give you an example of that in a second. People, distributors that were new in the business, they hadn't sold medical equipment or PPE ever, were taking massive down payments in the hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases, and then never delivering the material that they had contracted to deliver. And so on top of that, you had a bunch of new users. So suddenly first responders who had never felt like they needed PPE, teachers, long-term care facilities. So the state, including Governor Polis, the state of Colorado, determined that the states needed to be the supplier of these critical items where the normal distribution methods were unable to supply. The other thing, by the way, was the federal government, the SNS, which is the Strategic National Stockpile, really didn't exist, not at the levels that people were asking for. No, so that wasn't helpful. And there was no federal coordination, so that all of the states were sort of left on their own to go out into this gray market and try and purchase PPE. And the last thing I would say on just the environment was states like Colorado were never really in the business of buying PPE, not in huge quantities. We have agencies like Human Services that buy for normal, everyday human services functions, but the state didn't have an expertise in buying large quantities of this or anything else. And so our team was brought in. I actually stood up an 8-member team pulled people from various agencies, and we set up what turned out to be a pretty elaborate system of both identifying what we thought was quality product, trying to negotiate the best price we could, and testing, and then distribution of that product. And the end result of that was that we, over the course of the year, purchased about 30 million units of masks, gowns, face shields, and gloves. I am happy to say we're never defrauded. We never took possession of any item unless we tested it. We set up testing programs with both CU and CSU, and would only accept product once the test came back that it wasn't counterfeit and actually met the standards that we had purchased. And by the end of August, September, we had a couple of warehouses filled with stockpiled equipment. So overall, a pretty good success. We were also able to supply end users with materials that they couldn't get through normal distribution channels, which was part of the point. One example is Governor Polis sent, I believe, 5 million and then another 5 million masks to teachers throughout the state. So pretty successful, but also for any of you in marketing or in supply chain distribution, it's a really interesting example of a market that just turned completely upside down. The other thing I'll talk about for a minute are ventilators, because this is another example of what we really didn't know as well and started to learn very quickly into the pandemic. When I first started in March, clinicians were using ventilators quite a bit, and there was thought that the states didn't have enough ventilators. And in fact, one of our goals when I first came in was to purchase somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 ventilators in addition to what the state already had. And that drove a completely crazy market where you had ventilators that cost somewhere around $9,000 or even lower, maybe $6,000 pre-pandemic, that were selling on the market for $40,000 to $50,000. And you still couldn't get them. And so you had manufacturers that had never been in the ventilator business that stepped in. And a lot of them in very good faith, they were trying to help out, but they started to try and make vents. And then as we got into the pandemic, the clinicians started to tell us, we're starting to think that putting somebody on a ventilator is sort of the last resort. And we really don't want to put people on ventilators. And so we may not need all of these ventilators. And within a very short period of time, probably within 60 days, we stopped looking for ventilators. We ran a number of models, used some consulting firms, did the best math that we could, and determined that we thought, as things stood, that Colorado had an adequate overall ventilator supply. Not necessarily in all parts of the state. We were going to have to figure out how to get vents from one part of the state to other parts of the state, maybe. But that overall we were okay. And as it turned out, that so far has been true. And so that is just another example of the learning that went on very quickly throughout this pandemic. Not to mention, again, I had nothing to do with this, but not to mention creating vaccines in a year that were granted emergency use authorization. And as you know, all know from just what you've read, that was a pretty stunning achievement. So that's what was going on with PPE. So I'm going to switch to kind of where are we on the economic landscape right now. So as we got through the summer, we had some spikes in cases, and then we had leveling of cases, and then the cases as vaccines started to roll out. As you know, our case counts dropped, our percent positivity rates dropped. A lot of the restrictions were lifted. Doesn't mean we're out of the woods, and I would not, speak to all of the medical things that the world is still concerned with COVID, particularly variants. But things through the fall, early spring, started to get much better. So where are we today on the economic landscape? So you can see that in 2019, Colorado generated about 393 billion of GDP. That was 3.6% growth rate from 2014 to 2019, with a population of about just under 6 million Coloradans. But you also see that 2020 versus 2019, our growth rate was a negative 1.5%, and the US growth rate was a negative 3.5%, all due to COVID. I'm sure you've seen this graph. It's an interesting graph because what you're seeing here is historically high job openings that now have surpassed pre-COVID levels, whereas hires, there was a large dip and then a spike and then it came back down. But the graph says that they're kind of at normal levels, so to speak. So you have a lot of job openings. Hiring is not kept up, so it's an interesting graph to watch as we go into the next few months and the next year. This is also an interesting slide. It's labor force participation on the left-hand side, and you can see that that's also pretty much pre-COVID levels. And that's as of May, I believe, 61.6% participation rate, and on the right, employment to population ratio. And you can see the Colorado, just on those two graphs, is doing significantly better than the US overall. There are a couple of things to keep in mind with these graphs. One, there's been recent studies showing that there is a significant amount of retirement. We think that's happening in Colorado as well, but we know it's happening in the United States. One study last month found that there were 1.7 million more workers age 55 plus that retired than were projected during the pandemic. And of course, 55 plus is not, that's not a normal retirement age. And so we kind of wonder whether this labor force participation rate is being affected by just more people leaving the labor force. We're also watching how this is divided up demographically, either between men and women or other demographic groups, African Americans, Hispanics, white non-Hispanic, Asians, and trying to see where those differences are. And I think the upshot of all of that is that while smarter people than me, economists, believe that Colorado is on the right track and that we are pulling out of the pandemic recession, there's a lot of noise in the data, and there are a lot of questions, and we're not too sanguine about it. The other thing that's going on in the state and the United States and the world is supply chain. You've all read about that. The supply chains now are very constricted, and it's kind of an interesting thing because this recession, the pandemic recession, was really caused, at least in the beginning, by a lack of supplies. Businesses were shut down, whereas I think economists would tell you that most recessions start with a lack of demand. The consumers start to spend less, and consumers represent somewhere between 60 and 70% of the economy. Here now, the supply chain, whether services or manufacturing, are trying to reopen, but they're running into both constriction in raw materials as well as labor. Really hard to find labor right now, which is another interesting thing, back to the graph of showing that hiring is not kept up with the job openings. And so that's another statistic that we're watching, just to gauge how well is Colorado doing as it comes out of this pandemic. How well are people doing? So keeping an eye on all of that. So turning away from economics and into relief. So as you know, the CARES Act was signed in 2020, and then the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, was signed in March of 21. So ARPA was the 1.9 trillion. Well, ARPA's funding for Colorado was $27 billion. And of that, there was a large part that was direct aid. So you can see on this graph, K through 12, higher ed, childcare, housing relief, business relief, which included restaurants, the PPP program, unemployment relief of about $3 billion, and stimulus checks. Those are the $1,400 checks that was about $7 billion. The remaining portion of ARPA is divided into $3.8 billion to the state of Colorado and $2.3 billion to local communities, either counties, cities, towns, or what they call non-entitlement areas. So based on ARPA passing in March of 21, Governor Polis, in collaboration with the state treasurer, Dave Young, state House and Senate leadership, and legislators from both sides of the aisle, convened a series of 19 different regional, industry, and community specific meetings to hear directly from stakeholder groups on when and how to best spend the historic funding that the state was going to receive. Based on that feedback, the general sort of transformative areas that we landed on were affordable housing and home ownership, mental and behavioral health support, and workforce development. And so the next step was for leadership, both from the governor's office and the state legislature, to meet over a couple of months and determine more specifically the buckets of money that would go into these areas, the amount of money that would go into a couple of other areas that I'll show you in a second, and how and when it would be spent. And that resulted in a series of supplemental bills that were passed and have been signed or are currently being signed. Were passed in June and have mostly been signed by Governor Polis. So this is very high level because obviously there's a lot of detail on how this is being spent, but essentially what we agreed on was about $1.3 billion for fiscal integrity and budget stabilization and ongoing COVID response, including health response. About $1.3 billion to catalyze transformative change, and that's the three areas that I mentioned before: housing, behavioral health, and workforce development. And then about $1.2 billion for recovery and relief and job creation, which includes economic recovery and relief, transportation, infrastructure, parks, and agriculture. And that roughly comes down to spending about $2 billion this year being the next fiscal year. So the fiscal year starting July 1st, and the remaining 1.6 to 1.8 billion the following year. And I'll talk about the process for how we're dealing with both of those in a second. But just to give you a little bit of a sense, for the budget stabilization piece, about $1 billion for budget stabilization, fiscal integrity, about 300 million for COVID-related continuing response that's being spent this year. Affordable housing, 400 to 550 million. About 150 million of that is being spent this year, the remaining next year. Workforce development, 200 million. About 100 million or so this year, the remainder next year. Mental health, mental and behavioral health, 400 to 550 million. Again, about 100 million this year, 450 million or so next year. Recovery and relief, right around 750 million, about 80 million of being spent this year, the remainder next year. And transportation infrastructure, parks, agriculture, around 400 million, 378 being spent this year. And so before I get to a couple of process things, I also want to talk briefly about state stimulus. In addition to appropriating the ARPA funds, the state separately did about $823 million of state stimulus. Most of those bills were passed in late May, early June. And there are a couple of slides that kind of give you some high-level detail on how that money is being spent. You can see we have sales tax relief, we have relief for arts and culture, one-time grants for disadvantaged communities, revitalizing infrastructure, including broadband and downtown spaces, supporting Colorado families. Next slide. Rural Colorado, both forest restoration, agriculture, economic development opportunities, and workforce. And so the upshot of all of that is that we have a lot of recovery money, whether it's state stimulus or whether it's ARPA, to spend. And as those of you who have been in the state for very long know, this is very unusual for Colorado. Colorado has tapered. So Colorado isn't used to getting checks for $3.8 billion that it has essentially 4 years to spend. So it's a good problem, and but it is something that we needed to really focus on the infrastructure of the state agencies to know that we were spending this money in the best way possible, complying with all the rules, but also on programs that are going to the best places, the best use of those one-time funds. And so we have been spending the last few months, and will continue over the summer, to build infrastructure where we are developing structures for both spending, reporting, and accountability. We're creating interagency systems to support problem solving, centralized resources for implementation, general economic analysis to support future spending proposals, and ensure that spending is working. So what does all that mean? Essentially, what we're doing is setting up recovery officers who are tasked with making sure that, one, the money is coming in and being spent per a spending plan that has been approved, that there is accountability over how the money is being spent, that there is stakeholder input and outreach, and reporting mechanisms, plus auditing mechanisms, because we know that the state will be audited by both this probably state auditor and federal government to make sure that we were spending the money in compliance with the rules. And so those we are currently setting up, and feel pretty good about that we will have the structures in place to be able to implement these funds. To give you a sense of timeline on the ARPA funds, they have to essentially be spoken for by the end of 24, and then implemented or spent, we think, by the end of 26. I say we think because we're still waiting on more Treasury guidance on how all this works. There was some Treasury guidance about a month ago, but there's more to come, and that'll likely change some of the rules. But that's the timeline that we believe that we have to spend the ARPA money. So then finally, how do you spend the money in the next fiscal year? Not the upcoming one, but the next one. So the legislature is putting together interim committees for the various buckets, including recovery, housing, mental health, etc. Those interim committees will have subject matter experts and will be tasked over the summer and early fall with making recommendations to both the General Assembly, the JBC, and the Governor's office on ways to spend the additional funds that are most helpful, most transformative, and hopefully hitting areas of the economy that are not coming back. We're also we have state economists. We're probably going to add to that and keep an eye on what the economy is doing over the next few months, so that we can go back again to leadership and to the governor and report on what's working, what's not, and where we might be able to use recovery dollars to help ensure that Colorado comes out of the pandemic as good as possible. The final thing I'll say that's an unknown is infrastructure. So as you know, there's a lot of negotiations at the federal level on infrastructure. We don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know where things are going to come out. But if there's an infrastructure bill, that will be a whole new pot of money aimed at infrastructure that we will also need to go through the same analysis with and make sure that we have structures in place to spend that. But we don't have visibility on what that looks like quite yet. So that's what I had. Hopefully it's been somewhat helpful. It's obviously still a work in process, but I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pat. And to all of you listening today, feel free to submit through the Q&A any questions that you may have. We did receive a few already, so we'll get started with those. This comes from Casey. And what, if any, long-lasting positive, whether economic, social, or other, changes do you foresee based on Colorado's response?
Well, I don't think we'll know right away. The goal, obviously, is to have long-term positive effects. So, for example, affordable housing, particularly in rural communities, the great outcome would be to build more of it. And to have more workers in rural communities, especially in transitional communities that have lost workers because mines have closed or coal-fired power plants have shut down. So what we're trying to do with this money is not just spend it in a way that it has sort of a little bit of an effect over the next couple of years. And then once it's spent, everything goes back down to sort of baseline. And that's the exercise that we're going through right now.
Thank you, Pat. Here's our next question from Susie. I'm interested in how Colorado's response and challenges compared to other states.
Well, I think the states, this is just Pat Meyers talking. So, you know, there are people again who do studies on these things. I think in the beginning of COVID, all of the states were pretty much in the same boat. There were obviously some political difference. Some states just dealt with COVID different than other states did, but everyone was scrambling to figure out how to protect the citizens, how best to protect the citizens, how to buy PPE, for example, what the best clinical approach to treating COVID was. And so I think I will say that I'm very proud of the governor and the governor's team and the agencies. I thought Colorado did a very good job. We were nimble, and as new things developed, we reacted well to it. We have, I think, one of the strongest epidemiologists of any state, who was very on top of what was going on with COVID. I also think that problems varied. Massachusetts, for example, at the beginning of COVID, had significantly more cases, I believe, than many other states. And so their reaction to trying to get PPE in was different than the state of Colorado's. And it was things like literally sending people into China to safeguard supplies of PPE until it got on a plane and was headed back to Massachusetts. Colorado never needed to do that. So I think there were different levels of shutdowns and all of that, again, kind of more political than my world. But I think you saw similar pressures on all of the states, and also trying to deal with the federal government. Although I do want to say one thing that I forgot to say before. I've dealt with FEMA quite a bit, and I think the on-the-ground staff FEMA people are great. I think they really care about their job. They care about people. I would never gripe about FEMA. There were issues at the higher level early on in the pandemic about who was getting what PPE and materials and medical devices, and ventilators and all of that. And I won't belabor that, but the on-the-ground people, I think they wanted this to work as much as anybody did.
Thank you, Pat. And this question, similar questions came in from Joan and Natalie. In general, the sentiment of the question is, what is something we could have done better that we can see currently, just being a year and a few months into this? Is there anything you can identify of saying, hey, if we had done this differently, maybe we'd have a better or quicker result?
I don't think so. I mean, I know I'm biased, but at every moment, for what we knew, I thought we were doing things really well. And can you always, try and communicate something better, maybe? And again, I'm no expert on vaccine response, the testing response, but I saw it as part of the team, watching what our experts were doing. And I think, all in all, I can't think of something that I would look back on and say, gee, if we had only done this, it might have helped improve things quicker. So just vaccines alone, just again, from the outside looking in, trying to figure out the logistics of distributing vaccines, a couple of which were really difficult to handle because they had to be kept very cold and they had a short shelf life. And the governor brought in the National Guard to help. I just think people stepped up. So maybe in a couple of years, I think in a couple of years, there's going to be all sorts of PhD economists and health people who are going to be writing papers on this last year and saying what the world did right and what the world did wrong. But sitting here today, I think we did about as good as we could have done.
Thank you, Pat. And we have another question coming in, a slide from Karen. What is your assessment of the much higher level of job openings versus the actual hiring levels?
It's a really good question. And I think economists are trying to figure that out as well. I've heard different things. One, that it's a skill set problem, that a lot of the job openings are require skills that the out of work population doesn't have. I don't know if that's true, but I suppose that's one possibility. I also think, or have read, and intuitively it makes sense to me, that there are other things that are preventing people from getting back in the workforce, even if there's a job they're qualified for. Childcare comes up all the time. Childcare is clearly a pressure in the state of Colorado, and I believe throughout the United States. So if you don't have adequate childcare, it's pretty difficult to go back into the workforce for many people. So I think there are things like that that could be limitations on being able to go back in the workforce. We've all heard this notion that higher unemployment payments for keeping people out of the workforce. I haven't seen any studies that prove that, and I don't have an opinion on it, because I'm no expert, but that one to me, I really don't think so. I think people have a long-term interest in getting off unemployment and going back to work if they're going to be in the workforce. And if there's a job opportunity, they'll take that. That's a much better long-term thing than to try and keep what is really kind of a temporary unemployment payment, but who knows?
Yeah, all very good points. So that is all of our questions for today. So I want to give a huge thank you to Pat for this incredible information. I know I personally have learned a ton throughout today's session. And at this time, we invite you to provide your feedback on the webinar by answering the following poll question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to a friend or other CU alumni? And we thank you all in advance for submitting your feedback. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as a survey. To view upcoming webinars, as well as the previous recordings, please visit our website at www.colorado.edu/business/alumni. We hope you'll join us for our next and final webinar of the series, which is this Friday, June 25th, as CU Boulder alumna Vicki Shapiro, Vice President of Global Marketing for Match Media Group, presents The Dating Renaissance, How COVID-19 Has Changed How We Date. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time, and go Buffs.